Um, so, so I'm going to be talking about something that is still a project that we started a while back, but has been a bit on the back seat, and we're starting to reamp this. So this is work with J.J. Spoon, who's a professor at University of Pittsburgh. I'm going to talk a bit about how in political science we think about climate change and climate politics, and then I'm going to zoom in a bit on mobility policies broadly speaking, and then I'm going to talk about the specific paper/project that we are working on, where we find that there's some interesting correlations between bike lane provision and support for green parties in France. We have some indications or some guesses, some fairly or relatively educated guesses on why that might be the case, but we're still working on knowing exactly why it is happening. Before I do any of that, I'll just start by telling you how in political science and other social sciences we tend to think about climate change, and that is to think about it essentially as a political challenge. Jared Finnegan summarizes this very well when he says that the basic science of climate change has been known for a very long time. Hazards or the type of extreme weather events and things like that that can happen as a consequence of climate change have been known to governments and to some extent electorates for over half a century. We have countries negotiating a collective response or a global response to climate change for decades. We in political science tend to think of climate change as a purely or more of a political issue rather than anything else. Why? Because information about the nature of the problem and the nature of the possible solutions has been known for a very long time. We tend to think of solving climate change as principally and almost exclusively as a political issue, right? Now, whilst that might be the case, something that we see in a lot of the way that we as a public discuss climate change and environmental issues are not focused in politics, but are focused in very individual level behaviors, right? So it's things like what you see here on the left is a book for children in the UK, but you have a lot of these things that are not necessarily for children. And we see a lot of these things as consumers, as citizens, as students. And this is a book trying to educate people on how to be greener, which is wonderful. But as you can see from the cover, all these have to do with more like pro-environmental behaviors, who we as an individual may choose or not to engage. Again, very different than political macro level solutions for climate change or environmental issues. So sometimes this sort of political and non or less political world come together. So what you see here is a protest in the UK. I don't know if you can see it, but this sort of this banner in the middle says something like why love a dog and then eat a cow. So very often we see in political platforms such as protests, people making this connection between the political realm, change at the political level, but also changing individual level behavior. So, and when you look across the world and ask people who should solve climate change, so what you have here is a survey that is run in multiple countries. Here, they're all Western countries, and what they're asking people is who is responsible for addressing climate change. And if the answer one is government, if the answer zero is people, so what you see as the higher levels is more people say that the government should address it, and then you see that over time from the 1990s until 2010, sorry, which is when the survey ended, you see that there's more and more people thinking that is the individual rather than the government that needs to solve or that is responsible for addressing climate change. So we see these interesting patterns are on the one hand, we tend to assume in terms of political science that it's a matter of politics, whilst on the other hand, the public discussion is very much on individual level behavior that is often very depoliticized. So what we're trying to do in this paper is try to understand first cut, very high level, try to understand whether there's a connection between sort of the political realm of the policies that political actors might put in place. In this case, bike lane provision, so the act of constructing more bike lanes, and whether that actually has an influence on support for specific platforms. In specific, we're going to look at support for green parties. So what you have here is a campaign for more cycling in London. But what you have here is a photo that my co-author took in the US, where a campaign made this link very explicitly about more sort of greener or less carbon intensive modes of transport, such as bike and walk, but also with voting. So we're just trying to understand whether this type of policies and mobility policies actually have an influence on support for green parties or on elections in general. So I'm going to guide you through what we know from political science and other social sciences about these topics. I'll not go too much into the boring bit, and then I'll jump into what we're doing. So when we think about what is underlying support for green policies, and here I'm speaking in very broad terms about policies that are targeted at curbing carbon emissions, right? So the reducing carbon emissions. We know that at the individual level, things like education, socioeconomic status, influence the extent to which people support green parties and green policies. In general, across Europe, and most of the work I'm going to be citing here is from Europe, we know that more educated people and people from higher socioeconomic status are more likely to support these things than people from lower economic and educational levels. Now, this is what we call on demand side, so on voters' side. On the broader level, at the country level, we know that often sort of the country's level of GDP and the country levels of unemployment are good predictors of whether people support the green parties and climate platforms more than not. So we know there's this idea this work that calls green voting and climate policy support sort of a luxury issue, which is, we can talk about whether that's a good term or not, but the idea is that people only really care about climate policy and only really support green parties when the economy is doing well. So the economy is doing well, they don't have to worry about unemployment and the prices of things and whatnot. So they allow themselves to care about climate change. That's very broadly the logic, and there is some empirical evidence that shows that. We also know that the way that larger parties or centrist parties are reacting to green parties also influences how they support them, or how voters support them. We also know from previous work that the way policymakers decide to design their policies actually can influence the extent to which people come on board with those policies and actually support the climate or green agenda. So we know from work that the first citation here is from work in Spain, where they look at the phase out of coal plants. And what they find is that communities, so they look at a very specific case in Spain where the communities and the workers were involved in the project of designing the policies. And so because people had a say and felt like they were part of the process, they then became very supportive of the party that actually pushed for that policy. On the other hand, we also know that in some cases, the way we design mobility and green policies actually can drive backlash. So there is some evidence from Milan where they created sort of this low emission zone where older cars or cars that emit more need to pay a tax. And they find that actually that backlash is quite a bit. And voters instead turn for the party the radical right party that really opposes policies. Why? Because policy designers made it so that the costs of this policy were heavy on a very specific group of people. Okay, so the people felt like they were being unjustly treated, and then turned for parties that are less supportive of this type of platforms. Okay. So I'm going to speak a bit more about mobility policy specifically and the type and what we know that they can do from, again, previous work. So just to sort of place this a bit, we know that transport alone is responsible for 20% of total CO2 emissions globally. This is data from EIE from a few years ago. Different ways of estimating this will give you different numbers, but it's never meaningless. So it's always a large chunk of the emissions. We also know that mobility policies, usually those that sort of allow people to have more access to less polluting alternatives, are able to increase or improve the air quality in the places they're implemented. And we also know that things like bike lane provision, I'll say a bit more later, but bike lane provision actually makes people use bikes more. So whenever we create policies that actually increase the provision of specific modes of transport, it might not be an immediate effect, but we tend to find that people end up using them. So we know that they can influence behavior. And we also know that they can have electoral consequences. So I just told you about this called António paper that looks at Milan, but there's also evidence from Barcelona where they created these super blocks where it was only a pedonal zone, right? So where there was no cars and whatnot. And what these researchers find is that in this case, voters were actually happy with that policy and actually rewarded the mayor or the incumbent in Barcelona. So we often have this idea that whenever you create no car zones in a city, people will just be mad about it, and shop owners will be very will rebel against politicians. The evidence on that is a bit mixed, and if anything, from Barcelona, we know that people were actually quite happy. Right. So what are we doing here? We're going to look at whether bike lane provision, so a specific type of mobility policy, actually increases first the type of environmental friendly commuting habits that it's tried to. So whether it actually makes people bike more. And secondly, whether this actually spills over to political behavior, right? So whether this sort of makes people, for some reason, also makes people vote for the parties that they associate with more green lifestyles. I'm going to say a bit more as to why we know from previous literature and previous studies that this might be the case. So the first thing is that we have an area of studies called policy feedback, which argues and shows that sometimes the policies that we put in place themselves can actually sort of feed back into the loop of politics and influence how people feel about politics, how they participate, and how they vote. Okay, so policies are not just the output; they can actually be the input as to the whole political process. Secondly, as I've said, there's this evidence from an author that is one of them is actually based in Berlin, where bike lane provision actually increases use. So we know that bike lanes can change behavior. We don't know if it changes political behavior, but we know it changes behavior somehow. And the third thing is that there's a lot of literature from environmental psychology that suggests that that in some cases, when people engage in more pro-environmental behavior, like recycling or saving energy or something like that, for some reason they might feel good about it or something like that, they're also more likely to engage in other pro-environmental behavior. So there's this idea of spillover, right? So people do more pro-environmental acts, and as a consequence, they just do more of it. So there's a bit of a snowball effect. So combining these effects, we know that policies can influence behavior, bike lane provision specifically can influence behavior, and that there's this idea of environmental psychology that when people do things that are good for the environment, they might do more of that or more of other behaviors that are good for the environment. We have two main hypotheses. One, so going back to the same idea, one, that bike lane provision might sort of spill over and increase support for the Greens. The idea here is that the Greens are seen in most of people's minds, and there's a lot of evidence from this as well, that the Greens in Germany, but also in France and in other countries in Europe, Green parties tend to be seen as those that are more competent on environmental issues. And that's a long-lasting trend where people associate the Greens with more environmental issues. So the idea here is that that is kind of where you turn to if you want to do something for the environment when you go to cast a vote. The second thing we're trying to do, we're hypothesizing here, is that as the number of bike commuters increases, so does the vote share of the Greens, for the Greens, right? So again, this idea of spilling over. Right. So I'm going to say a bit about the context we're studying and the research design, but I won't bore you with all the details. I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A. So in in France, we have a growing emphasis on the idea of sustainable transport and environmental policies. Environmental policies are very often discussed around the idea of transportation. At local, but also at a more macro level, with things like the discussion around the ban of internal flights. There is a growing number of organizations that, kind of like you, strives for the recognition of the importance of cycling and tries to sort of translate it into public policy. And this idea, as I said, that the Green Party is seen as the party that owns the issue of the environment, but that is seen as more competent on these issues. We're going to look at municipal elections, so the local elections here. This would be, I guess, kind of the equivalent to Gemeinde in a bit larger to Gemeinde in Germany. The decisions on whether and how to build bike lanes in France is done at this level. So we're going to look at voting specifically on this level. And then they have I won't go too much into detail, but they have this two-round system with proportional representation. Okay. So how are we going to do this? We're going to look, as I said, support for the Green parties in the first round of municipal elections where all parties are running. We're going to have data from OpenStreetMap, which is sort of this geodata that has all the bike lanes and their geographic location, right? So we're going to use that, and we're going to match that using the maps, match that to electoral results at the municipal level, right? What you have here on the map, it's a bit hard to see, but is the number of bike lanes. You can see that a lot of places don't have any when we end the study, but a lot of them have some, and increasingly so. So we're going to look at, as I said, the number of bike lanes and whether there's an increase in the number of bike lanes that the place has. I won't go into the details of this. I'll spare you the trouble, but the general idea is we have municipal elections over time, and we're comparing those that had no bike lane and start having a bike lane to those that never do, okay? So we're going to look at the change in no bike lane to bike lane. First, I'm going to show you just the correlation of the number and support for the Green parties, but the more interesting bit is this idea of looking at the effects of changing from no bike lane to any bike lane. Right, so this is the correlation. What I want you to take away is that the more kilometers of bike lanes that a municipality builds, there is a positive association with Green Party support in the following election. That's the same whether we look at kilometers or the number of bike lanes. So we're not talking. We don't know here whether it's causing one another. We just know that there is, for whichever reason, whenever bike lanes are built in a specific place, in the following election, the Greens gain. Okay. Now the second thing I want to show you is this idea of going from no bike lanes to having some bike lanes. Okay. So what you see here, there's more details into sort of the research design and whatnot, but in the interest of time, I'll just explain the intuition. What we're seeing here is, so in blue, places that never had bike lanes, but then have one bike lane in 2020, and red, places that never had a bike lane, okay? And what you see in the horizontal axis is Green Party support. So what we see is that there's not really significant differences between the places that were about to have a bike lane and those that didn't in how much they support the Green parties. But once there is a bike lane provision, then we see a bit of a jump amongst those that do have a bike lane provision. Okay, so this is more trying to get at the causal effect here. And again, we see a positive jump in support for the Greens. This is another way of showing this, but in general, what we tend to find, and again, I'll spare you the research design details, what we tend to find is that whenever there's a bike lane built, the Greens tend to gain, not by a huge amount, the max like around 1 or 2 percentage points. So it's not going to change the world or change the composition of the mayor in many cases. It might in some, but in general, we tend to see a bit of a jump. Okay, so the last thing I want to show you is, so we find this effect that there seems to be an increase in the Green Party's support. We tend to think that this is because people associate the Greens with more green positions or green lifestyles. So we're going to do a bit of an exercise on trying to understand why. What is the mechanism, as we call it, underlying this sort of the main effect that we find? In the paper, we argue that there is an idea that, as I said earlier, that because people engage in more pro-environmental behaviors, there can be sort of a spillover, as I said, to also politics. So we're going to test this by looking at actual bike lane use. So what we do is using data. As I said, one of these authors is based in Berlin, but what they have is data on bike lane use from bike counters. So bike counters, I don't remember seeing them in Berlin, so I don't know where they are, but I know they exist in Berlin. But they are these machines that stand in strategic places by bike lanes, and they basically count how many bikers pass by on a day. So we're going to use data from those machines to look at whether places that had a bike lane or had the bike lane extended, whether that actually increases the number of people, right? Whether people actually engage on more pro-environmental behavior as a consequence. And what we find, again, I'll spare you the details here, but we find that there's a positive correlation, right? So when there's more bike lanes or when there's an extension of the existing bike lanes, there's more people using it. The second thing we do is to take that difference, so that increase in bike lane usage, and see if it's correlated with Green Party support. And we also see this. So again, this is all very exploratory, and there's a lot of things happening in the real world that we don't know and we're not controlling for here. But at a very descriptive and an early stage, what we find is, I'll skip this. What we find is that there is an increase in Green Party support. There is an increase in how much people use bike lanes when there's more bike lanes provided, and that this is also correlated with Green Party support. And currently, we're doing a bit more work, and we're studying it. We're doing a survey with people to really understand whether these things are connected, and if so, why? Whether they see them as part of the same thing, and more importantly, we're also trying to understand what are the parties saying, right? Because we're just telling a story as if there's no parties, but chances are there's a lot of campaigning or there's none. We don't really know. So we're trying to understand more what's happening at the politicians level. So I'm going over time, so I'll just conclude and then shut up and hear your questions. But very briefly, what we find is that mobility policies can increase support for the Green Parties, as we said. We're trying to understand why that is and what might be driving that. But broadly speaking, what we're finding is that behavioral habits, like by commuting and perhaps other pro-environmental behaviors, might actually influence political choice and how people vote. And that's all I had for you today. Thank you so much.